This was a bit of presto changeo, but welcome to adult education. We'll come in and get settled. Thanks to everybody in the class who was helping to move chairs around and get us situated here. As you know, this is Arts Month, and so the children and youth have been working on art projects and performance pieces for the whole month of February, and this is their chance to showcase those. They're in the recreation room, so we're here in Westminster Hall this morning. But really, what better place could we be than in this under this canopy of leaves to explore the book of Revelation together? This is the last session in our series on Who Do You Say I Am? Encountering the Newer Testament, and we are delighted to be together today. A couple of additional fun things, a couple of announcements this morning. Our scholar interview with Barbara Rossing, again, amazing. She really opens up the connections between the book of Revelation and the subject of ecology. So I commend that interview to you. Today is the final day to register for Church in the Round. We got a couple members of the Adult Ed Council who are staffing our Church in the Round table, or you can sign up on Realm. We'll be exploring Jesus' Sermon on the Plain in the Gospel according to Luke. And we deliberately prepared this year in cooperation with our colleague Elena from the Social Justice Ministry area. So we will be enjoying the fruits of that collaboration together in our small group experience during Lent. We're going to have another session of Adult Ed. I said this was the last one. That was not quite entirely true. We have a session on Palm Sunday. So we'll be studying the crucifixion that day, kind of the way that we did the incarnation in Advent. And finally, we have our suggestion box, which if it's not on the back table, I'll make sure it's there by the end of the session, or email us with thoughts or ideas. We're going to have 3 standalone sessions in May that follow up on this class. So if there have been questions that have stuck with you this whole time, please put them in there. We would be delighted to spend some time with those together. So I'm going to start off just by asking for first impressions of the book of Revelation. What are your expectations coming in today? What are your thoughts about what this book is like, or what we're going to find inside it? Violence, I heard. Yeah, we'll get some shouted out that I can repeat back. Violence. Lots of mystery. Lots of things that are mysterious, hard to understand. Yeah, what else? Inevitability. A sense that things are kind of fated. Yeah, yes. Not literal. Yeah, how are we going to interpret this? Matt and I did a division of labor where I just tell you what's in the book of Revelation, and then he's going to tell you what it means. So I really won this one. Yeah, so how do we interpret this book? Anything else? Any other first impressions for Revelation? Strange characters. We are going to meet some strange characters. Some of them are human, some of them are partially human. Yes, that's absolutely a feature of this book. Anything else? Scary, yes. I read it when I was a sophomore. I read it one night just before bedtime. Then I had dreams about global thermonuclear war. Yes, it's a fearsome book. Yes. Why is it in the Bible? We'll let Matt take that one. Yes.
That was my question too.
How did it get in there? What's it doing in the canon? And what does it add to the canon that it's in here? Yeah, any other thoughts or questions? Yes. A book of hope. I'm hearing we're going to hear some hope in Revelation. We'll see what we find. Yeah, anything else? It's a long book. No, it's true. There's a lot in there. So I am going to speed through an overview of the structure of Revelation. I told Matt that I would do an outline, but I could not help myself but come up with slides of images, because that's another thing to add about Revelation. There's so much vivid imagery in this book, and we'll see some of that as we're going through today. So we have a word of the day. It's lucky number 7. I guess that's a number of the day. We're going to see that number 7 repeated over and over again, and we'll see it play out kind of as a pattern. There's almost a musicality to the structure of the book of Revelation. We'll get to the number 6, and then there's a dramatic pause, and then we'll get to the 7th in any number of these series. So just look for that element of structure and pattern in the book of Revelation. It's written by someone who identifies as John. We often call this person John of Patmos. This is probably not John the Evangelist. For different reasons, we believe that this is not the author of the Gospel according to John. And he self-identifies here as your brother who shares with you in Jesus the persecution and the kingdom and the patient endurance. So there's a sense of persecution being kind of the backdrop to this letter. It begins with an opening prologue in which it identifies itself as the revelation of Jesus Christ made known to John. There's a sense that there's some mystery, I heard that word, being revealed here. And this opening vision, John says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a voice like a trumpet saying, write in a book what you see. That's the impetus for this whole book. And he turns to see whose voice it is and has this vision with the 7 lampstands, and in their midst one like the Son of Man in a long robe with a golden sash, white hair, flaming eyes, bronze feet, holding 7 stars with a sword coming from his mouth and a face like the sun, holding the keys to death and Hades. This is the opening vision that kicks off Revelation and sort of identifies who the true author or revealer of this book is. And so John writes this book, and he sends it off with 7 cover letters to 7 different churches. There's this name of these, he names these 7 churches in Asia Minor as the recipients of this letter. So, and there's a mini letter to each of the churches. I think there's a small group, Jerry's small group was reading these letters, actually. They're kind of fascinating. They're very different from Paul's letters. They're sent not to the people of the church, but to the angel of each of these churches. There's this sort of metaphysical dimension to all of it. The vision continues. God is enthroned here, surrounded by 24 elders with crowns on their heads. There's lightning, there's torches, and there's a sea underneath. You can see there's kind of an ocean underneath this throne. And I'm going to do this a couple of times where I'm going to say, I know this sounds wild and crazy, but the images in the book of Revelation are all over our hymnal. The sea of glass, casting down their golden crowns before the glassy sea, right? This is holy, holy, holy. This is number 1 in the hymnal, everybody's favorite. So before we dismiss this too much as weird, wild stuff, we have to know that we do own some of these images from this book. So yeah, there's the line from Revelation. So the sitting on the lap of the one enthroned is this book with 7 seals. We get that number 7 again. And then those seals are opened one by one. In the opening of the seals, we get the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And then we get a vision of martyrs under the altar. Those who have died in Christ are held in this special place. There's an earthquake. And the sun goes black, and the moon is like blood. And this is after the 6th seal. The earthquake, the sun is black, the moon is like blood, and the stars fall, and the sky is rolled back like a scroll. What hymn is that? It is well with my soul, right? The clouds be rolled back as a scroll. So again, let's not be too quick to dismiss the imagery of Revelation, because we do grab on to some of the beauty in it. After the 6 seals, there's this interlude. An angel says, don't do damage to the earth until we've rescued the faithful ones, this sense of preserving the faithful from their lives of persecution. And then the 7th seal comes, and what happens after the 7th seal? Anybody know? It's almost the scariest thing to happen yet. There's silence in heaven for half an hour. What does that mean? Who knows? But the structure of this book is just is beautiful. It builds to this crescendo, and then there's this pause, this rest. But then we get more 7s. We've got 7 angels with trumpets. 6 of them blow their trumpets. There's hail and fire. A flaming mountain is tossed into the sea. This is star wormwood falling into the sea. The sea is full of wormwood now. A pit opens. Creepy locusts come out. There are plagues. And then again, we have an interlude. And in the interlude, John is commanded to eat the scroll. Who else ate a scroll? Anybody remember? One of the prophets, one of our 3 major prophets. Ezekiel, eat this scroll, right? There's a lot of Older Testament images embedded in here. That's another feature of this, is a lot of Older Testament references. This author was very well versed in Hebrew scriptures. And so then the 7th angel comes with a trumpet. After this, we're going to get some portents. There is a pregnant woman with a dragon. This pregnant woman maybe represents the church. She's about to give birth. She's hidden away from the dragon and is able to give birth, and her child is sort of squirreled away to safety. Then there's a battle between the angel Michael versus the dragon. That shows up here. These are St. John's Bible images, by the way, very, very vivid ones. And then we get another set of sevens. We get the 7 angels with their bowls. These are more plagues upon the people of the earth. And then we get the woman and the beast. And the book of Revelation, not great on gender stuff. You'll hear some of this in, I'm seeing a laugh from Megan at the back. You'll hear some of this in our Barbara Rossing interview. But this woman is identified as Babylon the Great, mother of whores and the earth's abominations. So, and Babylon here, does anybody know what Babylon represents? The word, it's a city they can't name out loud, but it's the Rome, right? They can't specifically criticize Rome directly, but when they're talking about Babylon, they're talking about Rome here. It's coded language that enables people to talk about the dangers that they're facing. And then we see the fall of Babylon. A horseman, faithful and true, appears, and there's victory against all of the kings of the earth. The beasts are thrown into a lake of fire, and then we get another interval. This one lasts a lot longer. Anyone know how long this one lasts? 1,000 years. So there, we had a 30 minutes, and now we got a 1,000-year interval. And those who had been killed for their faith are resurrected and reign with Christ during those 1,000 years. And then Satan is released and defeated in a final battle. And then there's the final judgment before the throne. And the faithful stand before God and are judged. So that's the structure, the basic outline of the book of Revelation. So, Matt, at this point, I think it's probably crystal clear to everybody how we should interpret all of that, but I will allow you to come up and add any comments that you'd like.
This was a better idea when we planned it, I think, the way it is. There's more to the story. Margaret has left out the last couple of chapters, which we'll come back to. I'm not even going to say any questions, but now you know the basic plot. So, Oscars are coming up, so you don't want people to tell you the ending of a movie in advance. So, but Margaret, we'll come back to talk about the ending in just a moment. Of a strange book, but if you were around last summer, I did teach about writings that came in the time between the Testaments, and one of the kinds of writings we talked about was Jewish apocalyptic literature, and that word apocalyptic means revelatory, and the book of Revelation, as strange as it is to us, looks a lot like some other literature that Jews were producing in the 2 centuries prior to Jesus. If you remember, about a year ago, we looked at the book of Daniel in the Older Testament. The second half of Daniel has a series of visions that Daniel has, dreams that Daniel has, that also bear some resemblance. Highly symbolic, monsters, lots of play with numbers and things like that. This is simply to say that even though the book looks really strange to us, it would be more familiar to people in the first century, right? They've seen literature like this. Jewish groups are producing literature like this, and now we have Christian literature that's like this as well. All that's to say it was still odd to a lot of people. This is probably the last book to have made it into the New Testament. I say that because we have some writings from the 4th century, from the 300s, where some authors are saying, or an author is saying, some churches love this book, others really don't. In other words, the opinions seem to be very split on the book of Revelation. And even in some Eastern Orthodox churches, it's well into about the 11th century before a lot of them are really kind of comfortable with the book is overstating it. But it's an odd book. Martin Luther wasn't sure what to do with this book because of the way it depicts Jesus, because for some readers, the depictions of Jesus are not super recognizable. So I want to do kind of 3 big categories to think about some of the, the main points or the main efforts the book of Revelation is trying to express about Jesus, both in its judgment of things that it believes are wrong with the world, but also in this future vision of hope yet to come. So Revelation's depictions of Jesus. Margaret mentioned the scrolls, the book that's sealed with 7 scrolls, which is introduced to us. Chapter 4, chapter 5 is where John is ushered into this into heavenly places, right? He literally is taken up into heaven and able to see things. He sees this throne room, and there's this book, and the book appears to represent God's intentions or God's plan for the future. And so for the book to be opened means that future is about to begin. It's about to become unleashed. And we get this in Revelation 5. Anybody who enjoys some of the art that we have, William Blake, we saw him a bit when we did the book of Job. I wouldn't have wanted to hang out with William Blake. I'm sure he had really strange dreams, but he's got some very vivid and disturbing imagery. This is one of the tame ones on the book of Revelation. But the author says this, John says this, "Then I saw in the right hand of the one seated on the throne, God, a scroll written on the inside and on the back, sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming with a loud voice, 'Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals?'" Right? Who is the one who's worthy? Who has the authority to open up the next chapter, right, in God's intentions for the world? And no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or to look into it. I began to weep bitterly. This reminds me of dreams, right? Sometimes things happen in dreams and you're like, I don't know about you, I sometimes get very frustrated with my dreams. This is a little too much information probably. I think I'm either aware it's a dream or I'm aware I'm not acting the way I want to act. It's usually I can't get my phone to work. I have a lot of dreams like that, which... Anybody else? Okay. And then I wake up and I can't always get my phone to work. So, but John is grieved by this, right? He's going to miss something. Then one of the elders, one of these people around the throne, said to me, "Don't weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals." Who's the Lion from the tribe of Judah? Jesus, right? This is the Sunday school answer. He's the one who's able to do it. He's the lion, right? So we're ready for this ferocious imagery, right? Ready for a lion to come in, king of all the beasts, all right? So then John looks, and I saw between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders, not like Aslan the lion, but he sees a lamb standing as if it had been slaughtered, with 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. Some of the images Margaret had up earlier, you might have seen a lamb, and note, if you looked carefully, it did have 7 eyes and 7 horns, a little bizarre. But notice the juxtaposition that's going on here, right? The statement is, don't worry, right? The lion has conquered. The lion is worthy to do this. And then John sees, whatever this means, a lamb standing as if it had been slaughtered. It's weird imagery, like something that's been slaughtered typically can't stand. So we get a sense of not a strong animal, but we get a sense of a wounded animal and a slayed animal. In other words, there's something about the way the book imagines Jesus here where he still is the one who was crucified, right? He still, in a sense, bears all of the wounds, all of the history of the trauma, the death, the violence that he went through. So it's this interesting juxtaposition in a book that has so much to say about power, that at this moment when Jesus first kind of appears into the book in this imagery, he's quite powerless. At the same time, horns and eyes are also symbolic of power, right? Horn is a symbol of an animal's power or strength in a lot of biblical texts. There's that number 7 again. There's this sense of completion, right? And something about him symbolizes God's power in the world. There's a lot that happens between Revelation 5 and Revelation 19, but a time when Jesus shows up again in the future is at the end. And Margaret talked about this battle. You might have seen one of her final slides. There was a figure on a horse with a sword over his face. You saw that. You might have seen a wine press in the lower right. The grapes of wrath, right? Another more imagery from this book and from our hymnody and things like that. In Revelation 19:9, when it's finally time for this final battle to wage war against all of the evil powers of the world and to banish Satan once and for all, this is what we get. The angel said to me, "Write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb." And he said to me, "These are true words of God." So, again, marriage supper of the Lamb, this is an image of the unification of Jesus and his church. You might be expecting something kind of pleasant here, whatever it means to get married to a lamb. But the author then says, then I saw heaven opened, and there was a white horse. Its rider is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems, crowns. And he has a name inscribed that no one knows but himself, which is interesting, right? Names are symbolic of power, of being known. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. So the name of the robe dipped in blood, Barbara Rossing talks about this, seems to be another reference to Jesus' crucifixion, the violence that he himself has suffered. His name is called the Word of God. Where have you seen that before? Or does that ring any bells? John, I heard over here, right? John's gospel introduces Jesus as the Word, and the Word that becomes flesh. So another image of Jesus, this time he's riding a horse. This time he's not a lamb or a lion, he's a warrior. This is a statue at a church in Owatonna. Have anybody ever seen this before? Apparently the locals refer to this as the Burger King Christ, which I think is hilarious, but I've not been able to confirm this. So anybody with Owatonna roots can tell me afterwards. Once I say that, you'll never unsee it, right, with the crown. There's the Burger King Christ. It goes on, and the armies of heaven wearing fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron, the sense of his own speech being where the power resides. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh he has a name inscribed, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So one of the things about this book, right, when it comes time to introduce Jesus and his authority, we get lamb imagery, we get sacrificial imagery, we get the idea of somebody who suffered violence. We get a kind of humility, or at least a symbol of relative powerlessness. When it comes time for the final battle, however, you need a warrior for that, right? A slaughtered lamb's not going to do the trick, apparently. So this is some of the things about Revelation that have really throughout the church's history made some folks uncomfortable. When it comes time for God to exercise power and to transform the world, the kind of symbols that get used are traditional symbols of warfare and power over. Right? It looks very different from the Christ we meet on Good Friday on the cross, for example. This is where some of the criticism of Revelation has come over the years. Criticism from within the church, where it just sounds a little bit strange. That takes me to the second thing I wanted to talk about, is the way the book imagines, more William Blake, the way the book imagines judgment and talks about God pouring out judgment, to use that image of the bowls and pouring out. Margaret talked about some of the plagues and the pestilence that strikes the earth, which is stuff we've seen before. The book of Exodus talks about things like that, plagues when Pharaoh, in his arrogance, refuses to let the enslaved Hebrews go. So there's imagery of judgment in this book, and this would take several Sundays probably to dive too deeply into. But I just want to flag that and say the imagery of judgment is often disturbing to a lot of people. But we also want to notice that those words of judgment ring differently in other people's ears from time to time. Alan Bosak is he's a Dutch Reformed pastor. He was an anti-apartheid activist in South Africa. He's still alive. I think he's almost 80 years old now, and still doing stuff. He's going to be in Atlanta preaching and speaking, I know, in May. So very active in a Christian response, a theological response to apartheid in the 80s and even before. He's got a book on Revelation that always calls me back to reading this book in a slightly different way. It calls me back to reading Revelation in a different way. Just a couple of quick quotes. The oppressed do not see any dichotomy between God's love and God's justice. Right? We often hear language of judgment, and you can replace judgment with justice, right? That when God judges the world, it's not because God's angry or God wants to show off power. It's because God longs to bring justice into reality. And for a lot of us, at times we're tempted to see, is God loving or is God going to be just? Is God loving or is God going to exercise judgment in some way? And Bostock's argument here, in a nutshell, right, is if you've suffered injustice your whole life, you are eager to see God exercise power. Right? That seems to you an expression of divine love. A longer quote, this is where it hurts a little more. Christians who enjoy the fruits of injustice without a murmur, who remain silent as the defenseless are slaughtered, dare not become indignant when the suffering people of God echo the prayers of the Psalms and pray for deliverance and judgment. In other words, what he's saying is Revelation is a book that at various times, as far as we can tell throughout the history of the church, has been incredibly empowering to people suffering under the oppression of others, right? And the idea of longing for God to show up and to clean house, right? And to do what has to be done to dethrone, to defang those who are misusing power is a powerful way of seeing the book, right? It's part of the hope of this book is that God sees those who suffer and that God is committed to removing the sources of the power of injustice and evil and harm in the world. And so we want to recognize that as well. The book, I think, sounds differently to people whose lives are relatively comfortable. I'm going to put myself in that category versus how other people report on the power of the book and the meaning of the book or the sense of the book. So when we see these contrasting images of divine power, right, I'm tempted sometimes to choose the ones I like, reject the ones that I don't like. And I think Revelation, and maybe Bostock's reading of the book of Revelation, urges me to see those not so much as conflicting images, right, but the ones I have to figure out how do those hold together in a meaningful way. It's not just Bostock. Some of you might have heard the name Miroslav Volf, who's a theologian at Yale, who's Croatian and has horrible stories to tell about the ethnic cleansing in the Balkans. This was back, I forgot the years. This is the 90s, I think I remember correctly, early 2000s as well. So, who talks a lot about the power of a book like Revelation to help hopeless people hold on to hope, because at the heart of it is an image of a God who will not forget, right? Who will not forget those who suffer. All right, whose fault is it? From the perspective of Revelation, there's a lot going on about Rome. Margaret said, what did you say about Revelation? This is not a book that does well with gender. Is that? Yeah. You had a very nice understatement about that. The book of Revelation is, without exception, really the most anti-Roman book in the whole New Testament. In other words, the book that has the most aggressively critical things to say about the Roman Empire and its excesses. At the same time, the curiosity is it's probably the most misogynistic book in the entire New Testament. In other words, all of its imagery about women is, let's just say, extreme, right? Either in terms of extreme purity, how it imagines that, or extreme debauchery. And this matters for the way it talks about Rome and the Roman Empire. And I want to unpack that just a little bit because it's an important part of the book. And it helps us recognize, where did this book come from? Who thought this book was interesting? Why did this book get into the Bible? So Margaret put up a map earlier. Sorry, my line spacing got messed up there. These are the 7 churches that are addressed, that are all there in western Turkey, what's now Turkey. You see Patmos, the little tiny island there, where John is writing from, and he addresses this book to churches in 7 different cities in what was then called Asia. And again, this is now modern Turkey. All of these churches are different. They've all got different things going on from these letters. One of the things that we know, though, is that at the end of the first century, and this book's probably written in the 90s, the original 90s, like not 1990s, the 90s. All the vivid colors, yeah, all the pastels. Anyway, one thing we know about this part of the Roman world is that the emperor, what we call the emperor cult, was growing. And by emperor cult, what I mean is the expectation that part of good civic life meant you had to deify the living emperor as a god. Now, a lot of Roman empires would be deified after their death. In other words, after they died, the Senate would vote and say, we now think that Augustus was a god or is now a god. Well, that's good for business for some politicians. And so when you get to people like Nero, who you might remember that name, who was, this is not exaggeration, probably literally insane, the way in which he's described and just the savagery with which he ruled and the just aspects of his own ego. We could go on and on. All of a sudden you have emperors who start saying, like, why wait till I'm dead? I'm going to deify myself now. And so there are a variety of ways where different civic ceremonies would require people to offer some kind of prayers to or on behalf of the emperor, maybe just burn some incense or offer an offering, a sacrifice to the emperor. And this is starting to grow, and we know that in all 7 of these cities this is starting to happen. It's one of the ways in which this Roman province was trying to cultivate the good graces of the emperor back in Rome. Does this make sense? You're probably thinking it sounds familiar, but what do you do, right, to make sure the emperor likes you and make sure that benefits are flowing your way? And so part of that is, again, this part of the world is doing a lot to cultivate that. This appears to just sicken the author of the book of Revelation, right? This is idolatry, blasphemy at its worst, right? A human being claiming divine status. And so a lot of the book is written to these churches, urging them not so much to rise up, it's not a revolutionary book, but telling them to resist, right? To stay where they are, right? There's a line that you could cross, that you might be tempted to cross, and that line will take you into idolatry. It will take you into all sorts of other problems. The reason behind that is a kind of imperial arrogance that the book is just really furious about. And that comes out in the imagery that we see in chapter 17. And Margaret introduced this as well, right, when she was talking about how Rome is depicted. Rome's depicted as a woman. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great." And the language here traditionally in English has been whore, which I'm not going to use again unless I slip up. And the Greek word there is just simply the word for prostitute, but it's traditionally been translated a different way in English as a way of trying to heighten the disgust that the book feels toward her. This is a problematic word for a number of reasons. There's no moral nuance, right, about why somebody would choose or be forced into sex work or anything like that. So we have other ways of talking about this. But as far as the book of Revelation is concerned, this woman, Babylon the Great, we're told is who she is the height of immorality and the height of allure, right? There's an attraction to her that the book talks about. She is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have engaged in sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose prostitution the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk. So the blame being put on her, on Rome, is serious. This is part of the criticism of the book. The problem, of course, is the way it uses female imagery, female sexuality to be kind of the catch-all for so many of the criticisms. The author goes on, "So he, this angel, carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast." There's beasts in this book. One of them is introduced in chapter 13. More on that in a second. And this beast was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her prostitution. And on her forehead was written a name, a mystery. Here's that language of names again. Babylon the Great. So it spends time talking about Rome, Babylon, this woman who's allied with this beast, like this grotesque beast that she rides around on. When you get to chapter 18, what you have there is prophecy of the fall of Babylon, the destruction of Babylon, the death of Babylon. It's got a particularly violent, gory scene that describes the killing of this woman, which I'm going to skip over. But there is this, right after that's there. John says, "I heard another voice from heaven." And now here you've got instruction, right? What are you supposed to do in the midst of this, right? John's been watching incredibly powerful elite figures. What are you supposed to do? Now here's the instruction. "Come out of her, my people, so that you do not take part in her sins and so that you do not share in her plagues. For her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities," right? come out of her. Now, it's not that sure that John doesn't seem to be saying run for the hills, right? But refuse to participate in the things that the empire would have you do. This is long, but this is the description of the death of Babylon the Great, Rome. And the kings of the earth who engaged in sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, "Alas, alas, the great city, Babylon, the mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come." And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore, cargo of gold, silver, jewels, and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet, all kinds of scented wood, all articles of ivory, all articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble. You get the point here, right? All of these luxury goods. The author goes on, horses and chariots, slaves, and human lives, right? What is Babylon trafficking in? All of these luxury goods, but also human lives as well. This is maybe the closest thing we get to an anti-slavery sentiment in the New Testament here. And talks about all of Babylon, all the spoils. Going on, the merchants of these wares who grew wealthy from her will stand far off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud, "Alas, alas, the great city clothed in fine linen," etc. And all the shipmasters and seafarers, sailors, and all whose trade is on the sea stood far off and cried as they saw the smoke of her burning. "What city is like the great city?" In other words, who's going to buy all of our stuff now, right, with the death of this? "Rejoice over her, O heaven, you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has condemned her condemnation of you." Right? God has condemned her condemnation. The city that made you suffer will now suffer, or the empire that made you suffer will now suffer. So you see this kind of a revenge fantasy playing out here, right? But the message is not rise up, take up arms yourself. It's that God will do this. A couple more things, and I'll hand it back to Margaret. There seem to be some allusions to Nero in all of this. I mentioned Nero earlier, but the beast has 7 heads, a sign of perfection. This could also be a reference to the 7 hills on which Rome was built. The beast that's introduced in Revelation 13, we're told, has a healed mortal wound. Nero ruled back in the 50s and the 60s, but there were these rumors that he was going to come back to life. It was kind of the things you would tell your children to terrify them before they go to bed. Like, tell me their story about Nero. And you're like, okay, and, Nero's under the bed. Good night. I mean, it was like there were these rumors, right, that Nero was so evil, so vile, that either he wasn't really dead and he was hiding somewhere and about to come back, or that he was going to be reborn. And so there are some ways in which Revelation might be kind of playing with that. The number of the beast, if you lived in the 80s and listened to heavy metal music, you know it's 666. Big questions about who that is. For 2,000 years, the church has tried to figure it out. Also back in the 80s, I was told it was Ronald Wilson Reagan because there's 6 letters in each of his names, and that made sense to me. And I'm like, all right. So, the church has always done this. If you spell out Nero Caesar in Hebrew, and Hebrew letters have numerical equivalents, guess what it totals? 666. In other words, people have been trying to figure this out for a very long time. But there might be some Nero connections to that. This isn't to say that Revelation saying Nero was the Antichrist or Nero was the beast, we're done, let's move on. But rather, I think what Revelation is saying is that the spirit of Nero's pride and violence is just woven through the empire, right? It's woven through all of these abuses. Whatever the beast is in Rome, Nero's just one of many, right? You can find a Nero almost anywhere. Rome personified as Babylon. Margaret mentioned this. Christians began to refer to Rome as Babylon after 70. What happens in 70? The Romans destroyed the temple. Same thing the Babylonians did. Babylon's dead and gone in the 1st century, but this is a kind of code word for Rome. All of these references to abominations, blasphemies, intoxication, fornication, these are all talking about Rome's ability to entice, right? Rome is able to dominate militarily and economically. Rome is able to find allies, these other merchants, these other kings who go to bed with her. Seems to be symbolic of forming these alliances with her. So alliances that benefit ruling classes. Idolatry characterizes fornication or prostitution. We spent a little time of this when we talked about Hosea and Ezekiel well over a year ago. Unfortunate, but this is one of the images the Bible, some parts of the Bible use to talk about idolatry or faithlessness to God. I think we could use some better images than that, but when we see that, these are problematic texts, but so you know where they come from. It seems to be that Rome just simply provides choice conditions for idolatrous assumptions and activities. That seems to be the critique, right? What is Rome good for? It breeds idolatry, right? It breeds arrogance. Well, so what? My point is not that every single symbol in Revelation corresponds to a person or to an event. I don't think this is a book that we want to think we have to decode, right? As if it's that simple. Rather, Revelation at times just gives us an avalanche, right, of grotesque and decadent and voracious symbolism, right? Of beasts that make war, of Rome who entices, of a kind of economic exploitation that ends up killing some and enriching others. All of that seems to fit the context of Revelation quite well. In other words, this appears to be a book that's much more interested in describing life in the first century than it is in predicting life 20 centuries down the road, right? This is a book that ancient Christian audiences would have said, this sounds like what we're living in right now. At the same time, I think we don't want to keep the book stuck in the first century. It's important to know where it came from historically, but there are ways in which this book, I think, continues to speak about empires and continues to speak about misuse of power and continues to speak about the ways in which the church is enticed to take on values that are not our own. The line in Revelation 13:4, right? Who is like the beast and who can fight against it, right? Who can stand up to something like this? I would say gets played out over and over again in human history, right? To use an image from the civil rights movement, right? What does it mean to stand up against a force, a power, right, that seems so overwhelming, so deeply entrenched, so evil? And Revelation is trying to reckon with that in its own ways, some of which might be imperfect, some of the ways that might use symbolism that we might choose to replace. But this is really at the heart of the critique of the book. Most of the book is about critique of the things in the world that are dangerous. But then it ends on a happier note. So we're going to bring in Margaret to cheer everybody up. That's what she does. Yeah.
We're describing Donald Trump.
Maybe.
There you go.
Describing growth, too.
There you go. Yes. No, Matt and I definitely split this up well. So Revelation ends. We saw the last battle. We've seen all of these images of Babylon and its fall. But it ends with this beautiful set of images that I want us to just take a look at as we're wrapping up here. So one of these is the image of the New Jerusalem coming down to earth. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the new city, and I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down from heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. There's something, and so this is sort of this vision of the end of days, this vision of paradise at the end of all of it. And it's interesting that this vision is not a return to Eden, right? It's not a return to the garden, although we'll see some elements from that Garden of Eden story show up here. But the vision at the end is a city. It's a place of life together. It's not just a happily married couple, but it's people living together in harmony and peace. So that's one facet of the ending of Revelation that carries this hopeful note. This isn't everyone else gets destroyed and me and my family survive in a bunker, right? There's this vision of a new society at the end. And then there's the one seated on the throne, right? Jesus shows up at the end, not as a lamb, not as a warrior, but as the ruler of this new city. I am the Alpha and the Omega. We can see the Alpha and the Omega in that book there. And I am making all things new, Jesus says. So his participation, his sovereignty, his place in this city, in this heavenly city, is secured. And finally, I said that there was some imagery from the Eden story that shows up here. We see the tree of life. If you remember back to the very beginning of Genesis, there wasn't just one tree in the garden, there were two, right? There was the tree of knowledge of good and evil, But then there was also the tree of life, and this tree shows up in the book of Revelation. And there's a river, the river of the water of life. If we remember from Genesis 2, there's rivers in that story as well. This sense of water and of vegetation as these life-giving elements. If you watch Barbara Rossing's interview, this is where you'll see her make some of these ecological connections as kind of a grounding for how we can think about this book. And the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. So there's not this opposition between human life and the natural world. They're interlaced right there together. Flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. On either side of the river is the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, producing its fruit each month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. So whoever named hope in the book of Revelation, I think it does show up here. And there's a lot of tension in this book and things that we need to hold together. So we want to give you a little time to discuss as groups. We're not at tables today, but we can form groups together, and Matt will sort of lead you through this discussion part and then close it out. But the question for you as a group today is, what sounds like good news in Revelation, both in what it communicated to Christians 2,000 years ago and how it might still direct our attention? Okay, so what sounds like good news here? We'll give you a little time to discuss. Thanks. Don't be afraid to move your chairs. You did it once already. It was so helpful. Now you can scoot them again.
I'm going to reconvene us. We've got about 5 minutes, 6 really. Are there any adult ed council people who want to be microphone runners? Anybody? Claire? You can do half the room. Anybody want to do this half of the room? Anyone? Doris, you're hired.
Yeah, all right.
Thanks so much.
Oh, I'll try this.
This is a lot. This is a long book. This is a thick book. This is a problematic book. Some people have been wounded by this book. We want to give you a sense of kind of the focus of it, the historical setting of it, and a bit of the good news in it. What came out of your conversations? Obviously, the question tried to steer you toward good news as opposed to, disturbing, problematic. But anybody want to share what you learned in your group or what your group discussed? No, he's so chatty until I call you back together, and then you clam up. Dwayne, here in the front. Doris, if you could.
In our discussion, comment was made that this book, the Bible, is suggesting that we're waiting for God to come back. And to me, that's a bad message, because we need to do something now. And I think, relating to my earlier comment about the Trump administration, we need to be doing things to protest what's going on now, not waiting for someone else to come and solve it for us. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is a book that it's hard to find what the author is calling the church to do, but one of the main things is certainly that it calls the church to bear witness. And so what that looks like. John's writing to churches that have probably zero political influence in their world. That's not the same for most American churches today. So what the call would be for us today is worth talking about for sure. Yeah. Anybody else?
We were wondering what happened to the people in those churches who did not bow down to the emperor God. Do you know?
We don't know these particular churches. The best hypotheses of this book's probably written around like 92 or something like that, and just prior to that, there had been some kind of direct persecution of Christians. I mentioned Nero earlier, who's back in the 50s and 60s. Nero kind of famously was happy he found the political power in blaming Christians and imprisoning and killing some Christians. So it wasn't like there was widespread, emperor-wide, kind of legalized persecution against Christians, but it was in some places periodically and popped up. And it appears that in Asia Minor, where those 7 churches were, it was a dangerous place to be, a dangerous place to confess faith.
So when we were talking about hope, in the end, we realized that there was a lot of suffering that went on in this book before the hopeful part came, and we were wondering what it would look like for us to resist in the current time, and are we willing to undergo that kind of persecution?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't, and that's not to correct that at all, but to say that a book like Revelation reminds us that those kinds of considerations are in Christian DNA, right? I mean, early on, the church had to figure out what it meant to be not just a minority religion in the ancient world, but one that was occasionally really at odds with the ruling power and had something to say as criticism and paid a price for it, and what that, you know what I mean? Like, this is not our first go-around. What can we learn from that and from other episodes in the church's history is a really important question, I think. So, that was meant to kind of build onto what you said, not, okay. Good. Yeah, please, Betty.
So I haven't read Revelations in several decades because it's a scary book. But I saw something new today that I had never seen before, which provoked this question. So is Revelations